Hello, and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We're honored to have with us today in the studios of CSKC-TV in Pablo, Montana, James Steele Jr., the chairman of the Tribal Council of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Reservation. For our very first program today, we'll be interviewing Mr. Steele about some of the opportunities and challenges facing the tribes in the coming years. Mr. Steele's father, James Steele Sr., was elected to the Tribal Council for 1.5 terms in the 1980s and served for a term as the vice chairman. James Steele Jr. was just elected to his second term as a representative from the Arlee district to the Tribal Council, and then elected by his fellow members of the council to a second term as chairman. We're happy he's taken the time to be with us today. Thanks, Mr. Steele, and congratulations on your re-election.
Yeah, very much, Tom. Thank you.
Well, let's just get right into it. What do you see as some of the opportunities and challenges facing the tribes?
Well, just the last couple of days, right off the bat, has been the National Bison Range negotiations. We've spent the last 2 days talking to the Fish and Wildlife Service about entering into a new AFA with the United States Fish and Wildlife Society Service, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. And an AFA is?
Annual funding agreement. Okay. It's just a mechanism that contractual mechanism between the tribes and the federal government in terms of our relationship there at the Bison Range.
And before we get further into that, tell me why the Bison Range, you see that as an important issue for the tribes?
I think it's an important issue primarily with the history of the Bison Range and the way the federal government acquired the Bison Range, and also the history of the herd there, the Pablo Allard herd, and the genetic connection to that herd from this herd that's presently there. And I think also historically, just as a Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille people, our interaction with the bison. The Bison Range is wholly contained, as a lot of us know, within our reservation, and it's an important part of who we are. A lot of people have characterized the tribes primarily being interested in just the management and the money and those kind of things, but that's just a touch. That's not the whole issue. The main issue is our spiritual and traditional and cultural connections with the bison, and particularly how that herd is special to us here on our reservation. You know, our people were part of the ones that helped preserve the bison, and some of us know the stories and the history of that, and we have a pretty important part in helping preserve the bison. And
with the agreement or the plan that the tribes are interested in getting nailed down, what would that entail? What would be different at the Bison Range, or what would the tribes be taking on?
Well, I can't get into the details of where we're at in the specifics of the negotiation, but I can say, as I had stated yesterday on the local TV down in Missoula, we're looking towards a partnership on the ground and in the management structure there, and we're hopeful that it'll be a cooperative arrangement.
So the Fish and Wildlife Service would remain involved, and the tribes would be taking on some duties as well?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And for the visiting public, what would the difference be?
Well, I think for the visiting public, what they would see is two sovereign entities working together to help preserve the resource that's there, the buffalo, the bison, the elk, and the antelope that are there.
But it would remain open as a public facility?
It would remain a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge, Bison Range complex, and it would remain open to the public. Yep.
And are there some tribal members who wish the tribes could go further than that, who wish the Bison Range could be tribally owned again, or something like that?
I imagine there are tribal members that would want that, and I think, that's an ideal that we can look towards, but at this point we need to just concentrate on where we're at right now with this annual funding agreement process and this negotiations. But right now it will remain a Fish and Wildlife Service federal property, and that's the intent right now, and that's where it will remain.
Okay. Well, interesting. So you've had some pretty exhausting meetings, I take it, lately.
Yeah, yesterday and the day before, we spent all day, 8:30 to about 5:30, 6 o'clock each day, meeting and caucusing amongst each other and just talking about what we want to see out there.
Great. So, well, interesting. Well, let me go ahead and ask about some of the other issues that the tribes may be facing. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the state of health among tribal people. Health care, but also just what are some of the things that the tribes as a community face these days, and how are those being dealt with?
Well, I think in terms of health and well-being issues, one front that we are facing, all of us as a community, is illegal drug use, the illegal abuse of prescription drugs, and also the illegal drug issues on the reservation, methamphetamine and one in particular. I think we've tried very hard and need to continue to improve upon our efforts at drug prevention, use, and illegal use and abuse of drugs. I know Tribal Health has worked very hard at trying to curb the illegal use of prescription drugs. That's been a big problem. And the problem is with the use of prescription drugs, the illegal use of prescription drugs, is that there are individuals in our community that rightly have a need to use those prescription drugs, and when you have people abusing it, it takes away from those individuals that actually need those drugs. And so people often don't think of it that way, but if you're out abusing prescription drugs, you're taking that away from someone that really needs that for some, whether it's pain, usually it's pain medication that's being the most abused. And when you're abusing it, it just takes away from someone else being able to use that. But the other parts of it too is the cost of healthcare, the escalation of costs of healthcare and the delivery of healthcare is just going through the roof. And the healthcare inflation is outpacing the dollars that we get from the Indian Health Service. And it's a constant battle to get the federal government to kick in the adequate amount of dollars to cover the needs we have for our people in terms of health care.
How are the tribes pursuing that problem?
Well, the one thing is that one of the criticisms I get hit with a lot of times by a variety of tribal members and non-tribal members is making trips to DC. For a lot of years, our tribal chiefs, our tribal council members and chairmen have realized early on that a lot of the battles that we face in this new era of battle, which is not guns and knives and bows and arrows, but it's with words and education and knowing how to lobby Congress. And a lot of the trips, well, all the trips that I make to DC are not what some would consider vacation trips. They're not those type of things. They are, like as you asked on health, is to go back and say, look, remind the federal government, here's your treaty responsibility. And we're reminding you of that when you signed the treaty with us and negotiated it with us, part of it was helping to provide for health care.
So that's written into the Hellgate Treaty of 1855.
Yeah, not exactly that, but I guess the intent is there, is what I'm referring to, the intent of providing that health care for our tribal people. And part of going back to DC is being able to lobby congressmen, our Senators Baucus and Tester and Congressman Rehberg, to encourage the federal appropriation process to add more money to the Indian health care.
And how's that looking?
Well, you're always optimistic when you go back and ask for more funds for Indian health, but I've been on council for just 4 short years, and it seems like as soon as you get one foot forward, you always have other priorities on the national scene that take funds from everywhere. The war, the Iraq conflict, and the Afghanistan issue have taken a lot of money from the federal budget and moved it over into the Department of Defense, and that's what we're competing with.
Something like $8-9 billion a month, I guess, in Iraq.
And the needs that we have for tribal health, Indian health, I should say, nationwide would just be a fraction of those billions of dollars.
I'm curious, what is that national figure for Indian health?
I am not sure, but I approximately, I think it's $1 to $2 billion, maybe $2 billion. It helped with.
So less than what we spend in 1 week in Iraq right now?
Well, most definitely, yeah, most definitely.
Astonishing.
There's a statistic that a lot of my fellow colleagues will quote that we understand nationally the federal government spends more on the federal prison population for their health care needs than for our tribal people.
Yeah. I think we have more people in jail, too, than about any industrialized nation.
Unfortunately, I think we do. And not only nationally, but also a lot of our Indian people are in the prisons and jail systems, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the health care issue nationally. We're the only industrialized nation left that doesn't have national health care.
Yeah.
And if that existed here, as it does in every other advanced nation, Indian people that problem would be taken care of for Indian people as well.
Well, I agree with your point, and I disagree with your point. We as tribal people have in a sense, nationalized health care. I think if the national government applies the system of health care that they've used for Indian people to the whole nation, I think we're going to be hard-pressed to be happy with it.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I agree with you wholeheartedly. There needs to be some sort of national health care for our people, because there's a lot of people that just simply can't afford it. Yeah. But I also say that we need to really seriously reevaluate how the Indian Health Service provides their health care. I think we have the fortunate opportunity to have compacted and contracted some of that CHS we don't have right now, but we have a lot of the others.
That's Community Health Service.
Community Health Service, and but we have the opportunity to always approach them again and say we want to contract that, but we definitely do need some national health care of some sort. Yeah. I just wouldn't be too encouraged if they use something similar to what they've done with the Indian Health Service, because it sure has been kind of haphazard the way they have approached providing health care for tribal people nationally. So,
and you had mentioned within the health issue earlier the issue of substance abuse, meth, alcohol continues to be an enormous problem in the community. One thing I just wanted to do as a follow-up question on that is, what are some of the main strategies that you feel the tribes need to pursue on those issues?
I think one of the things that we need to learn from is years ago we had the Blue Bay Healing Center, and I hear that was very positive. You know, we had the sobriety camps up at the Powell grounds for a lot of years, and I think that's a very good model, and it was something that we all were proud to partake in, and there's been an effort to kind of revitalize that. I think we need to really focus on the preventative aspects of what we need to do, and also encourage and help fund the rehabilitation efforts that we have. I think we have a lot of areas of improvement. There's not one particular area you say, well, we're doing stupendous in this area. I think on all fronts we need to do a lot better.
That's interesting. And what about drunk driving? That to me is also one of the big risks that comes out of the substance abuse problem, and obviously not just tribal members, but non-Indians. And it often seems that you know, innocent people obviously get hurt or killed all the time with drunk driving accidents, and yet little seems to be done about it.
Well, I think you know, the tribes and the state of Montana have adopted some pretty stiff laws in that respect. It is an issue, and I think it should be dealt with accordingly. You know, if we need to change the tribal laws to deal with that more strictly or what have you, then we need to do that. But also on the other side of that is we need to, as I mentioned, the Blue Bay Healing Center and our alcohol prevention programs, we need to emphasize those too and assist them in ways that they see best in dealing with that. But also, you know, our law enforcement has participated with the state of Montana in various DOI check programs, and that's been a good thing and helped keep the people off the road.
Sure. I remember back in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president, Nancy Reagan, the First Lady, had that Just Say No campaign. And I always wondered, well, what are we offering to people to say yes to?
Yeah.
They're saying no to something, but it seems to say no to something, you have to be able to say yes to something else.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what the Blue Bay thing would kick in.
I think you hit on something exactly, because if we just focus on the preventative side of it, you also have to give an option for the positive side of it, the proactive side of it. You know, hey, give up substance abuse or alcohol abuse and move on to, you know, other healthy things in life.
Yeah. Okay.
You have to give them the options, and I think that's a good statement.
Well, thanks very much. We'll take a quick break now. We'll just be gone for 60 seconds. Don't go anywhere. Well, in the first bit of the program today, we talked about healthcare issues and the bison range issue. I'd like to touch now on the issue of cultural survival and the Salish and Kootenai languages. What do you see happening in the next year on that, or how important is that to the council as a priority for the tribes?
It is a very important priority to the tribes. I think one of the things that the tribes have done many years ago was help in the establishment of both the culture committees, the Salish Pend Oreille Culture Committee and our Kootenai Culture Committee. And in that was a commitment to see our languages preserved and also our cultural stories, our traditional stories, and our cultural ways and histories. In the coming year, we will see the continued funding for both those culture committees in the FY08 tribal budget, and also continued help and support of other language efforts. And I'm also very proud of our Kootenai community beginning a path of collaborating more closely with the Kootenai in Canada and Northern Idaho, and they've started a process of language summits, and I'm real glad of that we're starting to see that good collaboration there with our Kootenai language.
Exciting. And yet the languages are at this point critically endangered, aren't they? They're facing enormous challenges.
They are facing enormous challenges, and I think we need to heed the call. You know, recently I had read in the news the tribal elder that had died up in Alaska was the last member of that tribe that spoke fluently that language, and so that language has, you know, gone out of use and is extinct for all intents and purposes now. And I think we have the opportunity today to capture what we have and perpetuate it. And I see the tribal government, the tribal council, and the tribal organization, and it's not just the tribal council that does this, it's all of us together. This is a community effort and a community problem. It's not, putting money towards it is a big part of it, but it takes all of us to really preserve our languages, getting in there and knowing them and learning them. And
that's good. And for you and other members of the council, if you could say something just about why the languages are important.
The languages are important because it's part of who we are. It distinguishes us as a people groups from each other. You know, the Salish, Ponderay, from the Kootenai, we have different languages, we have different cultures and histories, but it's important to who we are. It's important as to the stories that were told. They weren't told in English, they were told in our tribal languages. And when you learn those tribal languages, and I'm still learning, I'm not fluent by any stretch of the imagination, but there's something about languages that when it's told in the language that the story was understood in, it has a different meaning than when you try to translate it into English. Or if you take a Salish story and try to translate it completely into Kootenai or vice versa, it has a different meaning in those tribal languages. And it's important to who we are as people. And
yeah, well, that's something I've heard from the elders as well, just what you said there. And it's exciting to see that there are a number of young people also jumping into teaching the language, learning the language, passing it on to even smaller children.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think that gets to where I was talking about. It's all of us. You know, we can't just say, well, it's the culture committee's job, it's the council's job, or just the elders' job. It's all of our responsibility to learn the languages.
That's great. And it's an issue that's related to sovereignty and issues of self-determination as well, isn't it?
Well, it is, because, you know, we are sovereign. There's a congressman from Michigan that's a real strong supporter of the tribes, and he often says, you know, it's not an earned sovereignty, it's a retained sovereignty. We have a sovereignty that has existed for thousands of years. And we are on a constant day-to-day defending of that sovereignty, whether it's interacting with the state of Montana or the counties or the cities or the federal government. There's a constant attack, either in big and small ways. There's an attack on tribal sovereignty. So it's a constant battle that I face, that the council faces, and people after me will face, is protecting and defending our tribal sovereignty. And part of the reaffirmation of that sovereignty is the Treaty of Hellgate, 1855. That's a government-to-government negotiated treaty with the United States. And the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution recognizes the fact that there's a relationship that the federal government has with Indian tribes that's unique in the standpoint with the treaty. In our particular case, we have that treaty that went through the same treaty process that other governments have gone through, the country of France or Canada and such.
And the Constitution declares that treaties are the supreme law of the land, isn't that right?
That's exactly right. They do declare that. And the biggest problem we've had is reminding the United States to not abrogate that treaty. And of course we all know it's been broken and abrogated and manipulated and changed in lots of ways in terms of congressional action and federal courts. But
one of the things about the treaty that I often hear the lawyers stress when they make a public presentation is it seems that many people in the public have a misconception of the reservation land. They think that the treaty, through the treaty, the U.S. gave the reservation to the tribes. My understanding is that's not correct.
That's not correct. That's if anyone would just take the time and read the treaty, it's actually the reverse. The tribes gave up, and this is the way I characterize it, the Salish, Kootenai, Ponderay people gave up a big chunk of, at the time, which was Washington Territory. Montana wasn't in existence at the time. Our tribes gave up that territory to the United States and reserved for ourselves basically the current reservation that we're on.
So in a literal sense, it's unceded land.
Unceded land, exactly right, yeah.
And that has a lot of legal implications, I guess.
Well, far be it from me to pretend to be an attorney, but I would assume that does have a lot of legal,
That's a good
legal ramifications.
A good caution. None of us should pretend to be lawyers, that's for sure. And in the Allotment Act passed in 1904, reservation was opened to non-Indian settlement in 1910. The U.S. Court of Claims later said that that was a breach of the treaty, and it led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of acres from tribal ownership to non-Indian. The tribes have an ongoing program of reacquiring land, don't they?
Yes, we do, and from my understanding, it's been ongoing from the 1930s. Proactively acquiring lands and turning them into trust status for the benefit of all of the tribal people and for all of us. And that's an ongoing effort, and I think we're at the point where we own, I think, 65 to 70% approximately of the reservation, where back when we signed the treaty, we owned all of it. And so we've been in that process of acquiring that land back. Oftentimes there's criticisms of the tribal council for buying that land back, and gets into the costs of the land and appraisal of the land and those kind of things. I think the guiding principle of the tribal government, the tribal council, in acquiring lands is to add that land back to our homeland. It's land that we owned, it's land that we signed a treaty for, and we understood that we were to own that collectively, and it wasn't because of the tribes, but because of the federal government and the Congress and the president at the time. They opened the reservation for settlement, and there's criticism for us for doing that, but I think in the long run, our grandkids and children and people down the road, our tribal people down the road, will be able to say, hey, we have a reservation, we have a homeland that our forefathers and foremothers had made sure we had and preserved for us to enjoy.
It's a value that goes beyond just economic interest, doesn't it?
It goes beyond economic interest, although today with escalation of property values, especially on the eastern side of the reservation, Mission Valley, from Arlee to Polson to Elmo, all the way up, the prices have just gone through the roof as to what we can buy, and that's the challenge. And the other challenge is the bigger parcels of property on the reservation, the thousands and thousands of acre ranches and such. We've done such a good job. We've bought a lot of those to where there's just very few of those very large ranches that were more prevalent in the past. Some of the Pack River land back in the 80s, those kind of pieces of property aren't as
Well,
here as they were before.
And this connects into issues of growth and planning on the reservation, and hopefully we'll be able to get to that in our next program, because we're happy to say that James Steele is going to return for our next program for another half-hour conversation. James, thank you very much for being here.
Very much, Tom.
And if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for the program, please email us at goodtalk@blackfoot.net. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.